Good morning. One thing is for sure, the election season has been anything but quiet. Under a significant amount of pressure from fellow Democrats, Joe Biden ended his run for re-election last Sunday afternoon, endorsing his vice president, Kamala Harris, for the job. With that change, there are some legal logistics that can't be ignored. Here to talk about everything that's going on is Dr. Bilal Sekou. He is an associate professor of political science at the University of Hartford. Welcome.
Welcome. Thanks a lot for having me here.
Something tells me what's happened over the past week will be on a syllabus of yours at some point in the future. Do you agree? Is this history in the making?
Well, the upside is I normally teach a class on elections and campaigns every time we have elections, and so this should be an exciting time before November, I guess.
So if you're a UHart student, you got an opening in your schedule, maybe pick that class up this year.
Exactly.
When you hear this news, do you look at it through the lens of history? Do you look at it logistically as a poli-sci professor? What was your first reaction?
I mean, I think all of those lenses are perfectly fine to look at this. I mean, this is really the first time since 1968 that we've actually had a president who decided not to run for re-election, who could have run for re-election. So it's historic in that, sense. And certainly Joe Biden has been, I think over time, history will show he will be, I think, considered one of our great presidents. I mean, in the 4 years that he's been in office, he accomplished a lot of different things, certainly for people who wanted to see him elected to the presidency in response to, the Trump years. And he came into office with COVID and, a country that, questions about our foreign policy. And so from that standpoint, he had an opportunity to do some really, important things and significant things that history may remember him well for.
You mentioned 1968, of course, Lyndon Johnson with the, I will not accept the nomination speech that we've all heard so many times. But that was different because in that case, he did it earlier in the process than what we saw here. Is it somewhat unprecedented to have a candidate? He hasn't been nominated, but it was clear he was about to be. So does that change some of it from your perspective?
I mean, I think everything in this moment is unprecedented. So, that question answers itself. And so this is territory we haven't seen. Certainly there are a lot of issues that still need to be worked out between now and the Democratic Party's convention, as well as between now and the election. There are a lot of questions. Some things are being sewn up. A majority of the delegates have committed to Kamala Harris, and so from that standpoint, she has a path to getting the nomination and being on the ballot. But there's still some questions about, that campaign fund, for example, that the Biden for president, a campaign built. I think it's around $250 million. The question of whether that money can be transferred now to her and her campaign, which is now Harris for, president. There are questions also about, how smooth this process can go. I mean, there are people who worry about a coronation, would like to see a bit of a battle. There are some out there, for the nomination to really sort of flesh out the best candidate. But I think at this moment, she has a clear path, I think, to the nomination and will be on the ballot in November.
Do you foresee, especially in today's climate with so much division among the parties and among the ideologies, do you anticipate that there could be legal challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Republicans have already started the legal challenges, especially around the money. And I think, ultimately our elections, if you look at, just how over the years, how more and more expensive our elections have become, money really matters, especially money coming from the big donors. And so she, did an amazing thing. I mean, in less than 24 hours, I mean, she probably about 72 hours, raised about $100 million. That's a lot of money to raise by any candidate. Fundraising has slowed down a lot for the Biden campaign. Questions about whether he was the right person to run for re-election really happened well before the actual debate, but certainly after the debate and his poor performance there, all of those things sped up. So Republicans are in court now challenging. This will go to the Federal Elections Commission, which has to decide. It's a 3-3 commission, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, so the likelihood of them getting a majority in either direction is highly unlikely. Some of the commissioners already given ideas or positions about what they think is the right thing to do with that money. But I think ultimately all of those things need to be worked out.
I want to ask you about the current president. I want to ask you about President Biden, because there's been a lot of talk about the idea that people knew. That we all knew from the outside after that debate. And maybe there were, certainly there were some hints and people talked about things and there were some, comments and stuff like that were a little unusual. But that debate sort of clued people in maybe to the amount of aging that had occurred over the past 3.5 years. Does that harken back? I mean, I was trying to do some research on it. There was some talk maybe in his second term, Ronald Reagan had some maybe dementia, maybe memory loss, and the AIDS kind of covered it up and just kind of shuffled him along. Are there comps in history and in the poli-sci world?
Well, I think, obviously Ronald Reagan is the closest example. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, basically a lot of people would argue his wife ran the presidency towards the very end because he had been incapacitated by, I believe it was a stroke. So, this issue about Joe Biden, in terms of the gaffes is something he had historically done quite a bit. But, that job ages you also. And so even leading up to the debate, there was a great deal of pressure. If you remember, his son was on trial. We had that. He was traveling overseas. And so there was a lot of things going on. But clearly, he is aged. Clearly, he's in his 80s. And so, if we're all fortunate enough to make it to our 80s, hopefully we'll have great health and our sort of mental acuity will be sharp. I'm not as sharp as I was in my 20s myself. So, so I think it's a natural process. But it made a lot of people in the Democratic Party very nervous about whether he could actually beat Donald Trump. The party has shaped up this election as being really an existential question and really present Trump as a real threat to democracy. And so winning this for Democrats is just critical, they think, not only for the party's success, but also for the future of our country.
Just one more question. We only have about a minute left. Does this maybe add some fuel to the fire of having some kind of age limit for some candidates? We've seen this more likely in the U.S. Senate. We've seen some senators serve to a very advanced age. Does something like what happened here and the panic to replace the candidate and what happened and what people saw at that debate, does it maybe change that?
I think it brings to the forefront that when we look at our leadership, our political leadership across the country, especially in Congress, but also the courts, I mean, it resembles a gerontocracy. And so, I think this election and the fact that Kamala Harris is younger, and I think going forward, when you look at the bench for both parties, younger people. So I think this may be, the sort of dying moment of, people who are that advanced in age, perhaps, taking the leadership. But as I've always said to friends, the American people had an opportunity to pick different candidates, and they chose two of the oldest candidates. And certainly, our confidence in younger people, especially my generation, Z, which seems to be skipped over in all of this, I think, that this election may be the one that will be a turning point for us in terms of how we think about age and competency and, what you bring to the job and your ability to do it and do it effectively, and also move the country forward into the future.
Well, it's a super interesting topic. I think we're going to be talking a lot more about it over the coming months. We really appreciate you being here. Hopefully we'll have you back. And like I said, those UHeart students better sign up for your class. It's going to be an interesting one this fall.
Absolutely.
Bilal Sekou from UHeart, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.